October 12, 1851. The air in the small parlor was thick with the smell of damp wool, old pine, and the finality of things. 17-year-old Lyra watched the lawyer's pen scratch across the final page of her father's will. It was a sound like mice in the walls, a sound of things being chewed away and carried off. Her older sisters, Hester and Agnes, sat straight-backed on the horsehair sofa, their faces pinched with a piety that did not quite conceal their impatience. They were practical women. They had nursed their father through his last coughing winter, and they expected to be paid in acres and livestock. Lyra had been the watcher, the one who sat by the window and observed the way the frost claimed the glass, the way the bare branches of the oak clawed at the grey sky. Her father had called her his little philosopher. Her sisters had called her useless. The lawyer, a man with a thin neck and a voice like dry leaves skittering across stone, cleared his throat. To Hester, the eldest, went the north fields, the farmhouse, and all its contents. To Agnes, the south pasture, the creek, and the herd of hardy cattle. Lyra felt the weight of their satisfaction settle in the room, heavy as a shroud. The lawyer shuffled his papers. And to Lyra he read, his voice devoid of any inflection, is bequeathed the parcel of land known as the West Wall. Hester's lips tightened into a bloodless line to stop a smile. Agnes coughed into her handkerchief. The West Wall was not land. It was a geological insult. A sheer, 500-foot cliff of worthless grey sandstone that marked the western edge of their property. It grew nothing. It housed nothing. It was a place where the wind went to die. The lawyer looked at her over his spectacles. The document is clear. That is all. Lyra said nothing. She did not argue, did not weep. She simply stood, her small form almost lost in the heavy silence of the room. "What will you do with a rock?" Agnes asked later, her voice not cruel, but genuinely baffled. Lyra looked at her sister. "I will have a look at it," she said. And she did. She walked out of the house that was no longer hers, past the barn that would never be hers, and toward the looming cliff face. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The west wall was immense up close, a silent giant. For 3 days, she walked its length, her hand trailing along the cold, rough stone. She slept in a hollow between 2 boulders, wrapped in the one blanket she had been allowed to take. On the 4th day, she found it. A fissure, no wider than her shoulders, partially hidden by a thick growth of stubborn, thorny bushes. An exhale of cool, damp air breathed from it, carrying a scent not of decay, but of deep earth, of minerals and stillness. She pushed through the thorns, their barbs tearing at her sleeves, and peered into the darkness. It was not a simple crack. It was an opening. The beginning of a cave. She went in. The air inside was not cold. It was still, and it held a strange, low-grade warmth, as if the stone itself had a slow, ancient pulse. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the warmth of the world's deep heart. The cave was warm. It was always warm. The first winter was a conversation with the stone. Lyra possessed little more than a cast-off pickaxe, a shovel with a cracked handle, and the mule her sisters had given her, a bitter-tempered creature named Cain that no one else could get near. They had thought it a fine joke. But Cain, like Lyra, seemed to prefer the company of rock to people, and he hauled away the rubble she carved from the earth without complaint. She did not dig wildly. She learned the cliff first. She spent weeks just sitting inside the mouth of the cave, feeling the subtle currents of air, watching how the dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the opening. She noticed the way the warmth was constant, a low, steady hum of energy that seemed to rise from the very floor. The stone wasn't uniform. There were layers of soft, crumbly sandstone she could break away with the pick, and then bands of hard, dense rock that blunted her tools and her resolve. She learned to follow the path of least resistance, letting the geology of the cliff dictate the shape of her home. Her first chamber was small, just big enough for her bedroll and a place to build a small, cautious fire. The smoke, she discovered, did not linger. It was drawn upward, pulled by an unseen force through tiny fissures in the ceiling, a natural and perfect chimney. It was this discovery that planted the seed of an idea. A neighbor, a kind man named Samuel who felt a pang of pity for the dispossessed girl, had given her a side of pork. It was more meat than she could eat before it spoiled. Remembering her father smoking hams in their old smokehouse, she decided to try. She hung the pork from a wooden peg hammered into the ceiling of her small cave, near the back where the warmth was most profound. She built a fire of hickory chips near the entrance, where the draft was strongest. The smoke did not billow and choke, it streamed, a steady, grey ribbon drawn through the chamber, caressing the meat before vanishing into the rock above. Her first attempt was a failure. The meat was acrid, coated in a bitter film of creosote. She had used green wood. The second attempt, with seasoned applewood, was better, but the meat was dry, cooked through by the cave's ambient heat. She needed smoke, not fire. Patience. It was a lesson the stone was teaching her. She dug a second, lower chamber, a fire pit connected to the first by a narrow channel. Here, she could build a slow, smouldering fire of hardwoods, letting only the cool, dense smoke drift into the hanging chamber. She tended it for 10 days. When she finally cut a piece from the finished slab, it was perfect. The salt, the smoke, the subtle, mineral warmth of the stone itself had conspired to create something sublime. It was sustenance. But it was also knowledge. By the spring of 1856, the single cave had become a catacomb of purpose. Lyra no longer thought in terms of days or weeks, but in the slow, geological time of the cliff. The west wall was not a barrier, it was a vessel. She had followed the seams of soft stone, carving out a network of chambers, each with a specific function dictated by the properties of the rock itself. The entrance chamber, coolest and driest, was for storage and packing. Deeper in, where the earth warmth was most pronounced, was the main smoking chamber, now large enough to hold 24 hams and 100 links of sausage. Its walls were black and glossy with years of smoke, a patina of pure flavor. Above it, accessed by a crude stone staircase she'd painstakingly chipped from the wall, was a venting chamber she had widened, a natural flue that drew the smoke with a silent, steady pull. She had discovered that different woods, smoldered in her fire pit, left different signatures on the meat. Hickory was sharp and assertive, perfect for bacon. Apple was sweet and subtle, a grace note for fowl. Mesquite, which she traded for with traveling teamsters, was potent, almost aggressive, and it transformed tough cuts of beef into something dark and transcendent. She had become a master of a craft no one had taught her, a craft born of solitude, observation, and the unique properties of her inheritance. Word of her had trickled down to the nearest town, Redemption. They called her the Cliff Girl, a half-wild creature who lived in a hole. But stories also circulated about the quality of her smoked meats. Trappers who traded with her for a few strips of jerky would arrive back in town with tales of its flavor, its perfect texture. It wasn't just preserved, it was transformed. She had established a small but steady trade, bartering her wares for salt, flour, coffee, and tools. She bought piglets from Samuel, raising them in a pen at the base of the cliff. She traded for venison from hunters who knew her reputation. Her life had found a rhythm, dictated by the seasons of slaughter and curing. The sisters' farm, visible from the high ledge she'd carved above her cave entrance, had not fared as well. Hester and Agnes were farmers by tradition, not by instinct. They planted what their father had planted, rotated when he had rotated, and cursed the sky when the rains didn't fall. They saw the land as a thing to be commanded. Lyra had learned to listen to the stone, to work with its inherent nature, not against it. Her smokehouse was not a building imposed upon the land, it was a space opened up within it, an act of cooperation. One afternoon, watching the distant figures of her sisters arguing in a field of stunted corn, she felt not triumph, but a quiet, aching pity. They had been given everything. And they had no idea what to do with it. She had been given nothing. And it had taught her everything. The arrival of Mr. Davies in the autumn of 1857 was as disruptive as a rockfall. He was a merchant from Redemption, a man whose face was a ledger of shrewd calculations and thin-lipped judgments. He arrived not on a mule, but in a sturdy buckboard wagon, its wheels seeming to complain about the rough track that led to the base of the west wall. Lyra watched his approach from her ledge, her hand still smelling of hickory smoke and salt brine. She did not hide. She simply waited. He was a man accustomed to announcing himself, but the silent, immense presence of the cliff seemed to steal his voice. He stared up at the dark opening of the cave, at the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke that curled from a fissure high above. Lyra descended the stone steps, her movements sure-footed and unhurried. Davies watched her, his eyes taking in her homespun dress, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the quiet competence in her posture. "You're the girl," he stated. It was not a question. "I am Lyra," she replied, her voice even. "They say you smoke meat in a hole in the ground." His tone was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. He was testing her. "The ground is warm," she said. It was the simplest explanation, and the truest. It was an invitation to understand, if he was capable of it. "I'll take a look," he said, tethering his horse. He followed her inside. The transition from the bright, sharp autumn air to the cool, dark stillness of the cave was absolute. The air inside was thick with the complex, almost sacred aroma of cured meat and ancient smoke. Davies, a man who dealt in commodities, flour, beans, salted pork from back east, stopped dead. His expression of cynical curiosity slowly melted away, replaced by one of genuine astonishment. He ran a hand along the smoke-blackened wall, looked up at the hams hanging in the dim light like strange, ripening fruits. He saw not a hermit's hovel, but a strange and perfectly ordered factory. Lyra said nothing. She let the place speak for itself. She cut a thin sliver from a side of bacon and handed it to him. He chewed it slowly, his eyes closed. The silence stretched. He was no longer a merchant assessing a product, he was a man having a revelation. He opened his eyes. They were different now. Clearer. "I'll take it all," he said, his voice quiet. Lyra looked at the rows of hams and sausages, the result of a full season's work. "I don't have enough," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. Davies nodded, already thinking of logistics, of markets, of turning this secret into a commodity. "Then make more," he said. "I'll be back in the spring." With a standing order for everything you can produce, he paid her in silver dollars, heavy and real in her palm. It was more money than she had ever held. It felt cold, alien, compared to the constant, living warmth of the stone. The following spring, Davies did not come alone. He came with a man named Rowan, a teamster who drove a massive freight wagon pulled by 4 stout horses. But Rowan was more than just a driver. His hands, calloused and strong, were the hands of a maker. He was a cooper, a man who understood the language of wood as intimately as Lyra understood the language of stone. While Davies talked of prices and quantities, Rowan's eyes moved over everything. He noted the rough path, the inefficiency of carrying finished hams out by hand, the lack of proper containers for transport. He walked into the smokehouse, his presence large but not intrusive. He didn't look at the meat, he looked at the system. He saw the genius of the natural flue, the cleverness of the separate chambers, the patient, relentless labor it had all required. He ran his hand over the stone, just as Davies had, but where the merchant had felt wonder, Rowan felt a sense of professional recognition. He found Lyra in the curing chamber, checking the salt brine on a new batch of pork bellies. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. "You need barrels," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And a better road." Lyra straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been observing him as well. She saw a man who did not waste words or movements. "I have the stone," she replied, her gaze steady. It was her way of saying she had her part of the world under control. "And I have the wood," he countered, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "And the wheels to make it go." He stepped aside, letting the light back in. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was making an offer. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice direct. She was not used to partners. Her only partner had been the cliff itself. "A third share," he said without hesitation. "For the road, the barrels, and the hauling. I'll get your meat to Redemption, Milligan's Fork, and Prosperity Gulch. Davies can handle the selling from there. And," he added, his eyes twinkling for the first time. "All the jerky I can eat." It was a fair offer. More than fair. It was a proposal that would transform her solitary craft into a genuine enterprise. She considered it, the silence of the cave amplifying the weight of the decision. She had built this place alone. But she knew its limits. She could not make the road, or the barrels, or the wagons. "You're not going to argue?" she asked, a genuine note of surprise in her voice. Everyone argued. Her sisters argued about fences. Davies argued about pennies. Rowan simply shook his head. Would it change the stone, he asked. It was the right answer. He understood that the foundation of the whole endeavor was the unchangeable, undeniable fact of the cliff. It was an acknowledgement of her work, of her discovery. It was the highest form of respect. She extended her hand. A third share, she agreed. Their handshake was firm, a practical, binding contract between earth and wood, stone and steel. The partnership was sealed. The years between 1858 and 1861 were a blur of construction and expansion. The alliance between Lyra's patient craft and Rowan's logistical vision was more potent than either of them could have imagined. The first thing Rowan did was build the road. With a team of hired men and 2 plow horses, he carved a wide, graded track from the main trail to the base of the west wall, a road that wagons could navigate with ease. The sound of axes, shovels, and men's voices replaced the quiet solitude Lyra had known for so long. She found she did not mind. It was the sound of her work reaching out into the world. At the base of the cliff, not far from the cave entrance, Rowan established his cooperage. Stacks of seasoned oak staves soon scented the air, a clean, sharp smell that mingled with the ever-present aroma of wood smoke. The rhythmic sounds of his hammer and adze became part of the cliff's daily music. He crafted sturdy, airtight barrels, perfect for transporting the precious, smoked meats and keeping them safe from pests and weather. Inside the cliff, Lyra expanded her operation. With the help of 2 young apprentices from Redemption, she opened up new chambers, following the soft veins of sandstone. They built a dedicated cold-curing room, its temperature moderated by a deep artesian seep she had discovered. They carved a massive new smoking chamber, capable of holding 10 times the previous quantity, with a complex system of vents that allowed her to control the flow and density of the smoke with minute precision. The face of the west wall was transformed. It was no longer a blank, featureless rock. It was a place of industry. Smoke now issued from a half-dozen different fissures, carefully chosen and widened, making the cliff itself appear to breathe. Wagons arrived weekly, laden with salt, spices, and butchered hogs from farms across the valley, and departed filled with barrels of Lyra's famous hams, bacon, and jerky. West Wall Meats was no longer a local curiosity, it was the lifeblood of 3 towns. From her ledge, Lyra could still see her sister's farm. The fences sagged. One of the barn roofs had partially collapsed. Weeds choked the fields where corn once grew. Hester and Agnes had tried to run the farm exactly as their father had, failing to adapt to a series of dry seasons and a changing market. Their inheritance, so rich and fertile on paper, had withered under the management of hands that knew only how to take, not how to listen or adapt. The land had exhausted them. Lyra's rock, in its quiet, patient way, had nourished her. It had asked only for attention, for respect, and in return, it had given her everything. The war came to the valley not with cannons and marching armies, but with whispers, rumors, and then, inevitably, with scarcity. The year 1862 brought news of battles in the east, and with it, disruptions that rippled through the fabric of their remote lives. Salt, a resource as vital to Lyra's craft as the stone itself, became difficult to procure and ruinously expensive. The young men who had worked the farms and ranches, providing a steady supply of livestock, were leaving to join the fight. Yet demand for preserved meat skyrocketed. The Union Army had a bottomless appetite, and its quartermasters were relentless. This new reality was a formidable adversary, one that threatened the delicate balance of the business Lyra and Rowan had built. It tested their partnership and her ingenuity. Lyra began to experiment. Forced to use less salt, she had to rely more heavily on the other elements of her process, the smoke, the air, and the unique warmth of the cave. She discovered that a longer, slower smoking with cooler, denser smoke could cure the meat just as effectively, imparting a deeper, more complex flavor. She became even more attuned to the subtle language of her craft, learning to achieve with smoke and time what she had once achieved with salt. Rowan, for his part, faced his own battles on the road. Old supply routes were cut off. He had to forge new, often dangerous paths to find what they needed and to get their product to the towns that now depended on them. He dealt with army blockades, desperate drifters, and opportunistic officials. One day, a Union Army procurement officer, a captain with cold eyes and an imperious manner, arrived at the West Wall with a requisition order. He wanted their entire stock, everything in the caves, for a price that was little more than theft. "This is for the war effort," the captain said, as if that explained everything. Rowan stood silently beside Lyra at the cave entrance. He would do whatever she decided. Lyra looked at the officer, her gaze unwavering. "Half of this stock is promised," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "To Redemption, to Milligan's Fork, to Prosperity Gulch. The people there are counting on it for the winter. The army has priority," the captain snapped. "The army has guns," Lyra countered softly. "The people have hunger. We will sell you what is not promised, at a fair price. But we will not let our neighbors starve." It was a moment of profound risk. The captain could have taken everything by force. But something in Lyra's simple, unyielding dignity gave him pause. He looked from her small, determined face to the vast, silent cliff behind her. He saw not a woman he could intimidate, but a force as implacable as the rock she inhabited. He stared for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost respectful nod. "A fair price," he agreed. For half they had faced down the war, and won. Their integrity had become as renowned as their bacon. The war ended, leaving scars on the nation and on the land, but the West Wall operation emerged from the crucible stronger and more vital than ever. The lean years had forced innovation and forged a reputation for reliability that was more valuable than gold. By 1866, Lyra and Rowan were no longer just successful business owners, they were pillars of the regional economy, their wagons a symbol of stability in uncertain times. The cliff, once a symbol of Lyra's disinheritance, was now the heart of the valley's prosperity. It was on a cool afternoon in late summer that the past returned. A lone figure, walking with the slow, defeated shuffle of the truly destitute, made her way up the road Rowan had built. Lyra, inspecting barrels at the loading dock, watched the woman approach. As she drew closer, Lyra recognized the gaunt face, the worn dress, the hollowed-out eyes. It was Agnes. Her sister looked 10 years older than her age. The farm, Lyra knew, had finally been lost a few years prior, sold for pennies on the dollar to cover debts. Hester had died of fever the winter before, a fact Lyra had heard from Mr. Davies. Agnes stood before her, a spectre from another life. The dust of the road was caked on her worn-out shoes. She did not meet Lyra's eyes. "I heard you were hiring," Agnes mumbled, her voice raspy. There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of the past. There was only the blunt, desperate need of the present. Lyra looked at her sister, the woman who had laughed at her inheritance, and felt a surprising absence of triumph. There was no satisfaction in this victory. There was only a deep, weary sadness for a life spent clinging to the wrong things. She saw the years of bitterness and struggle etched into her sister's face. Lyra simply nodded. She turned and led the way into the cool, smoke-scented darkness of the cave. The familiar warmth enveloped them both. She led Agnes past the great smoking chamber, through the curing rooms, to a clean, well-lit chamber at the back where finished jerky was packed into wooden crates. "The packing room needs a steady hand," Lyra said, her voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "The work is constant. The pay is fair." Agnes looked around the room, at the neat stacks of product, the organized workspace. For the first time, she looked at Lyra, a flicker of something, disbelief, shame, perhaps even gratitude, in her eyes. There was no grand scene of reconciliation. No tears were shed, no forgiveness was asked for or given. There was only the work. And the quiet, constant warmth of the stone, which had room enough for them both. Agnes started the next day, her hands quickly learning the simple, repetitive task of packing. And in the steady rhythm of the work, she found a quiet purpose she had not known in years. The years flowed on, measured not in calendar pages but in the slow accumulation of smoke on the stone walls and the deepening of lines on Lyra's face. The West Wall enterprise became a landmark, a permanent feature of the landscape. Rowan, his hair now white, managed the wagons and the accounts, while Lyra, her movement slower but no less deliberate, still oversaw the curing and smoking, her senses as sharp as ever. She had apprentices now, Rowan's son and daughter among them, young people who listened with reverence as she explained the subtle art of reading the smoke, of listening to the meat, of understanding the moods of the cliff. She taught them that the process could not be rushed, that patience was the most important ingredient. In the autumn of 1895, Lyra was 71. Her strength was failing, but her mind was clear. She spent most of her days sitting on a simple wooden bench Rowan had placed for her on the ledge outside the original cave entrance, the place where her life's work had begun. From there, she could watch the daily thrum of the business below and feel the sun on her face. Rowan often sat with her in the evenings, the two of them comfortable in a silence forged over decades of shared work and mutual respect. "The stone feels warmer than ever," she said to him one evening, her voice thin as parchment. He knew what she meant. She was feeling the pull of the deep earth she had lived with for so long. A few days later, she called Rowan's daughter, Sarah, to her side. Sarah had her father's practical sense but also a quiet, observational nature that reminded Lyra of herself. Lyra's hands, gnarled with age and work, rested on the sun-warmed rock of the ledge. "Listen to the rock," Lyra whispered, her breath a faint cloud in the cool air. "It knows how long things take. Don't ever hurry it." It was the sum of her philosophy, the secret of her success, passed on in a handful of words. She died a week later, peacefully in her sleep, in the small room she had kept for herself deep within the cliff. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. People from Redemption, Milligan's Fork, and Prosperity Gulch made the journey to the West Wall to pay their respects. They did not mourn a strange hermit who lived in a cave. They mourned the matriarch of the valley, the woman who had built the foundation of their prosperity from a wall of worthless stone. They buried her in a small plot at the base of the cliff, in the shadow of her great work. The smoke from the curing chambers, now tended by Sarah's hands, drifted over the assembled crowd, a fragrant, living incense, a promise that the work, and the warmth, would continue. Today, if you travel the back roads of that high desert valley, you can still find the West Wall. It stands as it always has, a silent, monolithic testament to geological time. The road Rowan built is paved now, but it follows the same gentle curve he first carved from the hillside. The entrance to the main smokehouse is still there, a dark mouth in the cliff face, now sealed with a heavy, rusted iron grate by the County Historical Society. A small, weathered bronze plaque is bolted to the rock nearby. It tells a brief, factual version of the story. Lyra, the West Wall Smokehouse, established 1852. It lists dates and production figures. It speaks of commerce, of regional history. But it cannot capture the truth of what was built here. It cannot explain the philosophy that seeped into the very stones. What Lyra discovered in that cliff was more than a place to live or a way to make a living. She discovered a principle. She learned that the things the world deems worthless, the barren rock, the overlooked girl, the slow, patient process, often hold the most profound and enduring value. In an age that was beginning to fall in love with speed, with conquest, with the quick and violent extraction of wealth from the land, she chose a different path. She chose to listen, to observe, to cooperate. She did not conquer the rock, she entered into a conversation with it. Her legacy is not just in the memory of the business she founded, but in that quiet, revolutionary idea, that true wealth is not something taken, but something carefully and patiently cultivated from a thing that everyone else has thrown away. As the sun sets, it strikes the face of the West Wall, and the grey sandstone glows with a deep, fiery red. For a moment, it seems as if the cliff itself is blushing with warmth, a vast, geological memory of the slow fires it once held within its heart, and the quiet woman who first had the wisdom to feel it.